One of the things you need to consider when you're doing an ecological restoration project is how do you protect your ecosystem from external influences. So here you can see they've installed a wide barrier of pine trees, and what that's doing is protecting it from the agricultural lands across the road. So inside your restoration project is protected, and then you have to consider things like how do you protect your area from cows or from ATVs or other disturbance elements that are going to come into your property. So maybe you need some sort of fencing or some sort of a gate like this, so that you're preventing the access from these different disturbance elements. And once you're into your restoration project, then you're basically working with that element. And what the barriers on the outside are also doing is preventing wind from coming in. All the weed seeds that are in the agricultural field, you're preventing them from coming in. So you're preventing that drying factor. You're kind of creating a microclimate behind here that allows for more moisture and allows for the plants to grow more easily with less disturbance. And here on this edge, you can see that we've got a lot of early successional species in here. So sumac is a pioneer species. It colonizes quickly, and over time different woody species will be able to come in to this area. So these sumac were seeded into this area, and other areas were seeded with tall grass prairie. And so you're initiating the ecological restoration. You're initiating the succession process. So because this field was highly disturbed by agriculture, the soil was very depleted. It used to be a tobacco field, and so the soil was basically sand and not a lot of organic matter. So initially you're building up that organic matter, setting the stage so that it can return to forest. And a lot of this area around the edge is Carolinian forest, or temperate forest I should say. But because of this has been disturbed so much by agriculture, you can't go straight back to your climax forest. You can't go straight back to your reference ecosystem. You have to take these steps, moving through the pioneer species, restoring the soil back to health, and then hopefully you'll have your species seeding in from the edges. And you can also put in some of these climax species, but they're going to struggle initially because it doesn't have the right conditions anymore to go straight back to a forest. So it's one of the things you need to consider when you're doing an ecological restoration project. You may have a reference ecosystem that you think it should go to, but because of some sort of disturbance, maybe it's in agriculture or maybe it's a mining area, you can't go straight back to forest right away. You have to work with different stages and bring it back to a forest through multiple stages. This area is an older restoration project. So you can see that they originally planted a lot of pioneer species, and they still exist closer to the edge. But as the ecosystems developed more, you can see that the trees are still small, but they're filling in enough so that it's creating more of a canopy now. And as you move into the forest, you're noticing the meadow species are starting to disappear, starting to fill in more. And there's a whole variety of both pine species, conifer species, and deciduous species of different species that are in here. And so it's a much more diverse ecosystem, and you have these different layers that are starting to develop because they have some of the pioneer species in here that are holding the ecosystem together. And gradually over time, like this early pioneer species sumac, it's died because there's not enough light anymore, and the ecosystem is changing, so this species has died back. It's an early pioneer species. It needs a lot of light, and it grows quickly, reestablishes, helps change the ecosystem over, but then it has a limited lifespan. And so when you're planting an ecosystem like this, you want to make sure you've got your pioneer species, and then you're mixing in all the species that you need at the later stages. So they take a much longer time to grow up to a larger size and to fill in that canopy. But these pioneer species do that job very rapidly, and they close it in and start changing the conditions more to a woodland ecosystem. So when you're doing an ecological restoration, a lot of people want the quick bang for the buck, and so they're quickly putting in, well, we want a maple and oak forest, and so that's what we're going to put in there. But they don't allow for the successional stages to get it to that stage, and so they're missing certain components of that ecological succession. And so it's making so there's individual trees spaced widely apart, whereas if you had put the pioneer species in between those trees, it actually helps to force the later successional species to grow more quickly, so that they compete for the light as well. In this area over here, you can see the original forest, and the area behind me is a restoration of a gap that was in the forest. And so what we're trying to do is fill in the gaps in the forest and create more core area. And so we're putting in early successional species first. We have a mixture of prairie and grassland species, but then also these early successional woodland species, and then mixing it up with these later successional species together, and that creates our forest mosaic, and it's much more rapidly establishes. In the city ecosystem, people are using the Miyawaki method, which is basically you're digging down the soil, putting a lot of organic matter in there, and then you're planting trees very close together, both pioneer and climax species, mixing them together so they're very close together, and basically they're forcing each other to grow up taller faster. So that's what a Miyawaki method is using, is basically it's digging down a meter into the soil, putting a ton of organic matter. So it's kick-starting that ecosystem, kick-starting that organic matter, and it kick-starting the forest processes so that it establishes much more quickly. So behind me you can see a tallgrass prairie that's being restored. So it's probably about 3 to 5 years old, and so it has a mixture of different prairie grasses, a mixture of different wildflowers, and the ecosystem is extremely complex, having all sorts of different seeds for different birds, but also having wildflowers for butterflies and different pollinators. So it's an extremely important habitat to have, and it's actually a very rare habitat in Canada, because much of this tallgrass prairie area has been destroyed because it's underneath has got rich soil, and agriculturally people want to use that. So to do this tallgrass prairie restoration, they've prepared the land. It was originally in an agricultural area, and you can do tilling to prepare the soil, and then afterwards they came in with what's called a truax drill, and then they seeded the whole area. And they've also come back in and added some oak savanna species, so black oak that you can sort of see scattered around the area, and they must have done a burn recently because it has multiple sprouts instead of a single stem coming up. In the area on the edge, so beside this tallgrass prairie area, you can see there's another restoration type where they're planting much more trees into the mix, so it still has that prairie mix that they're using for seed, and then on top of that they're also adding all this forest species. And in the background you can see the original forest, and that's what they're trying to achieve over time. But having a bit of a mosaic, you've got these different strategies. Okay, this area is going to be in tallgrass prairie, And so that allows for certain species that need tallgrass prairie to exist in the large prairie area, grassland species, grassland nesting birds, that sort of thing. And then you've got a forest mosaic. So you've got a forest that's new and it's starting to grow, and then in the back you've got older forest. And so you have this kind of different mosaic, and it's allowing different species to exist. And because you have more different habitats and different ecosystems within a small area, you increase the amount of biodiversity that's going to be using this area. So certain species are using grassland, certain species are using young forest, and certain species are using older forest. So in order to protect this rare habitat and to prevent ATV use, cows, that sort of thing that are going to damage the ecosystem, they put up fencing to prevent people from entering, and they've also put up a barrier of conifers along the highway. So that's preventing a lot of the noise pollution, it's preventing a lot of the dust and different invasive species, so it's minimizing that impact on the ecosystem. You can see that there's multiple cars that keep going by, and so that's also a disturbance for the wildlife. So you want to try to minimize the impact for wildlife so that they can have a quiet area, a natural area, so they can exist, reproduce, and have another generation. So this is what we need to have, is these large areas rather than having the little tiny spots. You need to have large areas for different species to exist, and so you can have multiple different species, and so things like hawks and different predators can have enough area that has enough rabbits or birds or whatever the predators need to eat, not just the grassland species and the herbivores. So within the tallgrass prairie ecosystem, it's fire dependent, and so this area is burned regularly. And here you can see what's happened. This oak species has been knocked back, so the original stem has been burned, and then it's come back. All these are new shoots coming up from the bottom. So this is a fire tolerant species, but at a young age it's not fire tolerant. So it's being knocked back from the original stem, and it's coming up from new shoots from the base. And the reason that they burned this tallgrass prairie is to remove some of the biomass, to stimulate the prairie species, the grassland species, to grow more vigorously. They actually spread out their rhizomes whenever there's a burn. It reduces the biomass, allowing the different prairie species to grow up through it, and it blackens the soil, so it's killing off a lot of the cool season species, which in Canada, those are most of the invasive species, are cool season. So when it burns, it kills them, knocks them back enough, and then it blackens the soil, so it warms the soil up even more, and that allows a shift in the community towards a more prairie ecosystem. And these oak savanna species can survive and tolerate that, and once they get up to a good size, then their bark is actually fire tolerant, and you can burn a tallgrass prairie and the oak trees survive. And one of the reasons they're also burning is to remove some of the invasive species like Scots pine that are seeding into these areas, and those are fire intolerant species. And so fire is an effective management tool for removing these types of invasive species. This area is a 200-hectare plot of land that was formerly agriculture, and they've been trying to restore this back to the temperate forest that's all around here. And one of the processes, because it's a very large area, you needed to have multiple processes to bring it back to health. So initially what they were doing is creating pioneer species to help restore the soil, and you have things like sumac, and you have the grasses at a different level, you have a variety of different shrubs in the background, and you have things like these nitrogen fixing plants So you're adding all these different components for an early succession, and you're trying to move it, so restoring the soil and restoring the carbon in the soil. And then on this side, what they're doing is they've planted more climax species, so a mixture of different climax species in what we call pod planting. So to save some expense, you've got these little pods of climax species mixed in with your pioneer species, and that allows for these areas to have sort of a nucleating effect. You have a pod, and then hopefully over time it's radiating out and dropping seed into the other areas and helping them to restore faster. But you can still see you've got your pioneer species in here. You've still got a lot of grass species. You've got things like strawberry, that's a ground cover. This is a nitrogen fixer. You have things like your milkweed pods, which are for the monarch butterfly. But over time, this is gradually going to fill in more and more, and the canopy is going to close, and then this whole ecosystem will start to shift to more of a forest ecosystem. Right now it's more of an oak savanna. These are black oak here, and underneath you have prairie species. So if it shifts more to an oak savanna, then the trees will be more widely spaced apart, and you'll have more prairie grasses and different shade tolerant species, so it'll be more of a mixture. If it shifts more to a temperate forest, then you'll have more canopy closure, and you'll have less of this vegetation on the ground. You'll have more spring ephemerals that come in the early part of the spring when the leaves are falling off. So they're taking advantage of that early flush of light, and then they're finished early in the season. So here you can see this is another nitrogen fixer in here, and it's just mixed all together, and you're getting a really good diversity of species in this ecological restoration project. Having these trees in different areas and having the pioneer species in different areas, it's increasing the amount of biodiversity in the area, and this area is just full of birds eating the seeds, eating the insects, and moving everything all around. So birds in a forest are excellent for restoring a forest, because when you attract birds to an area, they'll eat your seed and they'll move it around. And a lot of the conifer plantations that they're doing actually rely on the wildlife moving these seeds around to restore the forest. I can show you that later, where we go into a conifer forest and you can see the understory of little trees, and none of those have been planted. They've been introduced by the wildlife. So one of the indications that you're doing well in your restoration project is that you start getting the mushrooms back. So there's enough organic matter in the soil that the mycelium can start moving around and colonizing this different area and start breaking down the organic matter and start returning it into the soil. And here you can see it started to develop an organic layer, but if I dig down, you notice it's only a very thin layer so far before we get down to the sand. And as you can see, it's very fine sand, but it's starting to turn brown. So it's increasing in the amount of organic matter. It was a much lighter color before. And so just that, slowly adding more and more organic matter. The trees are dropping down the leaves and building that up. Let me just restore that back, so we're not having exposed soil, and just covering the whole ground with this organic layer increases the amount of moisture in the soil. It allows other plants to come in that couldn't tolerate the really dry conditions that were here before. The trees are shading the soil, and gradually the whole ecosystem starts to change. And you can see there's more open space in here, more open space around me as the trees start to take up more of the light themselves, and shifting the community to more of a interior forest rather than an open field. So with this mushroom, not only you see the fruiting body, and underneath here are the gills where the spores come out, and those will be raining down, and some of them are so light that they'll actually go up into the atmosphere. But underneath the ground, there's this whole mycelial network connecting everything together, going to the plants, going into the organic matter, going into the soil, releasing chemicals into the soil that will break down the nutrients and break down the parent material, the sand, into materials that are usable for the plants. And then they start having an interchange between the plants, and these plants gradually redevelop their mycelial network, because that's been lost when you have an agricultural system, and soon they'll be able to connect with each other and reestablish the wood wide web. Thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Your support keeps these videos free for everyone.